Pledge of Allegiance. If you cannot, please remain seated. Pledge of Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, thank you, everyone. Thank you, thank you. All right, so Ms. City Clerk, do we have any citizens signed up to speak during citizen participation?
No, we do not.
Okay, all right, any presentations this evening? No, we do not have any of those. All right, Mr. City Manager, City Manager's report.
Mr. Mayor Pro Tem, I don't have a report this week.
Okay, wow, we're moving quite a while along. Thank you, Mr. City Manager. All right, so Council, I have in front of us consent agenda A through C. Can I get a motion?
Motion. Second. Motion approved.
All right, thank you. Now, new business. Oh, all in favor? Aye. All right, thank you. Motion passed. Those opposed? All right, great. No one opposed. Okay, new business. Pecan Ridge Conservation Subdivision proposal. The developer, those representing Pecan Ridge, please approach the hearing. Stand, please.
Mr. Minor,
Yes.
Mr. Minor should go first.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Developer, if you have a seat, we need to hear from staff first. Pardon me 1 second. I was just briefed on that as well. Yes, thank you, Mr. Minor.
Okay, good evening, and Mayor Pro Tem Gardner and members of the council. For the record, I'm Joe Minor, the Bowie Planning Director, here to introduce this item to you. And I did want to say at the outset that this is a request for annexation to be considered, and it's something that's a unique opportunity that the council has not really seen in the past, where you have a developer actually come in prior to the development of their site and ask the council to consider annexation. Mr. Gibbs is the attorney representing Caruso Homes, and they'll present in a few moments, but I wanted to just let the council know that Mr. Gibbs had called me last week, and he reminded me that actually it was staff, city staff, that initiated this conversation about annexation. This project is a 42-acre proposed subdivision called Pecan Ridge. It's located up in the Old Town Bowie area, and the developer is now going through what's called a conservation sketch plan review. Conservation sketch plan is an internal staff level planning director approval at the Park and Planning Commission, so it's not really a plan that goes through public hearings. But what we wanted to do is show the council the proposed plan for the development as a frame of reference so that you can understand the type of development that's being proposed. There are 80 lots on this proposed plan, but it is in a state of being designed. So this request tonight is for the council to entertain the idea of going forward with an annexation of this property. And what we would be looking for tonight is for your direction to staff to continue our discussions with the developer if council is interested in doing that. And that's all that's required tonight, is for council to provide whatever direction you'd like to provide. I can show you a couple of slides just to orient the council to the property. I mentioned that it is located up in the Old Town Bowie area. Just to the top of the drawing is Old Town Bowie. This is 11th Street. Lloyd Station Road is the road that comes down the hill towards the Horsepen Branch Creek, and the Pecan Ridge subdivision is located right here. This is an aerial photograph, and the property is developed as a farm. There's also a grove of pecan trees located right in the southeastern corner of the property, and the WB&A trail runs right here. So the WB&A trail is a major pedestrian feature that borders the subject property. This is a map that shows in the purple color the existing city boundary, and as council is aware, The Old Town Bowie was the original part of Bowie, and it was connected to the Levitt area by way of the old Route 197, which is now Lloyd Station Road. So the Pecan Ridge property is adjacent to the city limits. This is one of the drawings that was submitted with the sketch plan that shows some of the environmental features on the property. And one of the interesting things about conservation subdivision design is that it permits a clustering of lots. So you're able to preserve the more environmental features or other features that are significant on the property. So you have a wooded stream area along the northern boundary. You have the pecan grove that I mentioned down near the WB&A trail. This is a drawing that shows some of the features on the site. There are some older buildings. Also, the Pepco power lines abuts the property to the west. In the upper right-hand corner is a photograph of the pecan grove that exists. This is an example or a proposed drawing that shows the conservation subdivision scheme, which would involve a single entrance road coming from the end of Lloyd Station Road and then going up the hill to provide access to the major portion of the lots. And finally, this is the Woodland and Wildlife Conservation Plan, which is just another view of that development. So in closing, I just wanted council to be, to remember that we are moving ahead in accordance with council's past direction to look at opportunities for annexation. When it's consistent with this council's policy, it is within your designated growth boundary. And so we've had that conversation with the developer, and they are interested in talking with you about annexation. We also did a very rough financial comparison to see what the tax revenue generated would be versus the expenditures the city would need to provide to serve this development. And we believe that the level of development, the type of homes that are going to be sold there, would result in a positive financial situation for the city. And so we would recommend your dialogue tonight and direction to staff, and that would conclude the staff presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Meyer. Okay, now I'm going to ask that we have the developer representing Pecan Ridge approach the bench. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you.
Mayor Pro Tem and members of the council, Edward Gibbs, an attorney with offices in Largo, and I'm pleased to be here this evening representing Caruso Homes. I'd like to introduce Mr. Jeff Caruso, the founder and president of Caruso Homes, and then to his left, your right, Andy Garrich, his development director, and then behind Mr. Garrich is Phil Hughes of our civil engineering firm, Rogers Consulting. Again, we're pleased to be here this evening. Thank you very much. I would like to tell you a little bit about Caruso Homes. Mr. Jeff Caruso founded the company in 1986, and they started as a custom home building company only, and today, while they still have a custom home branch, they really are community developers, and they're developing residential subdivisions in the Washington metropolitan area. They have a project or two down in North Carolina, but their roots are deepest really in Prince George's County, where they have 6 projects ongoing today. They were approached with the opportunity to acquire this 41 or 2 acre property known as Pecan Ridge, currently a working, I guess I would call it a horse farm. It goes back many years and was part of a larger assemblage of property at one time. So Mr. Caruso and his team looked at the property, and they felt that they could do a very attractive subdivision and develop the property. It's zone RR, which allows 20,000 square foot lots. So what they chose to do was they chose to try to use a technique called conservation subdivision. Basically, under this technique, if you have a piece of property that has unique features to it, if you save those features, you're allowed to use smaller lots, in this case as small as 6,500 square feet as opposed to 20,000 square feet, in return for saving these features which you ordinarily would not have to necessarily save. The key is your density cannot exceed what it would be under conventional development. So you're not getting extra lots per se. So they're proposing 80 lots under this subdivision, and they're proposing to save basically as much as they can of the pecan grove, which is a significant natural feature, and also preserving view sheds into the property, which are quite nice. So that's the technique that they're using. What I'd like to emphasize to you is that we're not here to ask you for a subdivision approval. Under the sketch plan process, or under the conservation subdivision process, you have to file a sketch plan. It gets reviewed by staff at Park and Planning. It never goes to a planning board. It's not a binding approval. They're basically looking at the sketch plan to see whether or not you have dotted your I's and crossed your T's for the technique that you're using. And then the planning director says you have, then you're allowed to file a preliminary subdivision plan, which carries with it detailed analysis of lotting patterns, access, traffic. That's way down the road from where we are right now. So when Mr. Meinert, he was involved in the sketch plan process after we filed it, and he mentioned to me that annexation might be something that would be beneficial for both parties to discuss, because we're in your growth area, we're in your master plan area for annexing into the city boundaries. For us, city schools are great. City services are great. We have police protection that would be closer from the city than it would be from the county. And so we thought it would be potentially a mutually beneficial exploration to undertake. And so we are very interested in pursuing the annexation. We'd like to try to move it forward to achieve a negotiated annexation agreement that we would bring back to you. And so basically we're here tonight to answer any questions that you might have, and to hope that you'll be interested in moving this along as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for coming forward. Ms. City Clerk, do we have anyone sign up for a public hearing to speak? Thank you, ma'am. Okay. All right. First, I'm going to call Mr. Bruce McLawhorn to come forward. If you would, there you are. Thank you, sir, for coming out this evening. Thank you. You may go ahead.
My name is Bruce Milam, and
Okay.
pulling down just a little bit. Is that
Okay. Yeah, that's great.
Bruce Milam, and my wife, Debbie, and I have lived at 8010 Lloyd Station Road for the past 16 years. And we're opposed to development and annexation because the road access is poor, runoff issues already exist on both sides of the property. Historical sites are near and will be disturbed, and 80 homes will overbuild the developable land. Parking is inadequate with the plan, and the development will ruin the rural nature of the area. The road access is poor. The current interchange is unsafe in a car and really unsafe with a trailer or truck from Route 197. The first left on the normal school is unsafe with any vehicle due to the forward visibility. The safe turning spot was blocked, that was open for 30 years, was blocked by an unnecessary guardrail about 3 years ago. 80 homes with 2 to 3 cars each will result in weekly car wrecks, and it'll be an additional 150 to 300 cars in that area. That's up at the top of the hill. There's an A-shaped area that's off the top of the map. And it's just a very dangerous interchange. The road by the stream is narrow. That's in the middle of the page. And floods during heavy rains now. In the winter, the area to plow the snow is limited, resulting in one-lane road and standoffs between drivers that lack common courtesy and are unwilling to pull to the side where it's a little wider. And that's with 18 vehicles in this area at the moment. You know, add another 150 to 300, and that'll all be worse. The plan has inadequate parking for each house, and it'll have 2 to 4 cars. Some home accesses alleyways, and cars will be on both sides of the road, leaving one lane down the middle, and cars will spill onto the jogging trail and also onto the roadway. The drainage is inadequate on the property. With additional homes, the access road will flood more, making it difficult to stay out of the ditches as it is now when it really rains. And on the other side of the property runs over the road lane at my home, and it washed out our driveway culvert at one time. It was very expensive to repair. And another 80 homes will make that worse. Like in Ellicott City, the homes uphill at Triple Crown Court, the previous development up above us, it's called considerable runoff to come through the property and cause these problems. Another 80 homes will actually make this worse. And then during construction, the muddy runoff will be a big problem. The property has a historical significance also, and around it, there's a slave house on the property that will be destroyed. It will be torn down. The footings of Lloyd Station Road are right beside the road. The footings of Lloyd Station, that's what the road's named after, are still there, and that's right beside their road access. And then also there's a historic railroad bridge there in that area down near the road. 70 or 80 houses will overbuild the property. It has a zoning of RR now. As he explained, they can build large homes on much smaller property. That would be around 2/10 of an acre. And it'll pack the homes together where the home is 41% of the lot size. So it's planned congestion. They only have about 15, 16 acres that they can build on with this plan, and that's room for about 30 homes of this size. So it will be very congested for the people that buy there. And the development will ruin the rural nature of the area that we've loved for the past 16 years. My rooster crowing at all hours of day or night will not be welcome. The tractor run at 3 a.m. seeding or spreading fertilizer before rain will not be welcome. An occasional whiff of manure while spreading will be unwelcome. And the light pollution home will displace the wildlife, creating a completely different community. The development with homes packed on 2/10 of an acre will completely disrupt the community. And so for this reasons, I would ask that you would vote no on this annexation and oppose the development. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for coming out. Next, we have Miss Nancy Johnson. Thank you, Ms. Johnson, for coming out this evening.
Oh, sure. I don't like speaking in front of people, so here we go.
Okay.
My name is Nancy Johnson. I live at 13307 10th Street in Bowie. My parents bought the property at 8500 Lloyd Station Road in 1949. So I know this property formerly known as Hillside Farm, where Pecan Ridge is located. My family has concerns about the possibility of development. Currently, there's no water or sewer to this property. The current traffic pattern is dangerous enough because of poor sighting. That's Normal School Road and Racetrack Road, and plus where Lloyd Station Road reaches into 11th Street. And my next point is, who will manage the section of Lloyd Station Road that are not being annexed into the city? And where is the buildings sites that was shown to us? There are no preservation of any of the houses or barns or anything that are there. The 4 farms adjacent to the property have horses and other farm animals. These animals come with smell, noises, and dangers that 95% of the perpetual homeowners are unaware of. And I can tell you now, city folks do not like chickens or geese or cows. And how will the horses access the WB&A trail for trail rides? I started riding the trail on horseback in about 1958. Then it was dirt. Since then, the Park Service paved the trail. I and others, including cyclists and joggers, use Lloyd Station Road as an access. Now it is safe because, as Bruce said, there's probably 18 to 20 cars that go down the road. At 150 to 300, it won't be safe for anyone. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Next up we have is Nebeski. It's Nebeski.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak.
You're welcome. Thanks for coming out.
I want to start by saying that I oppose this, and I know
Okay.
this is not the place for that, so I'm not going to belabor it. My suggestion is that this is not a welcome development for the community that already exists. We are not in the city of Bowie, although we utilize the city, and we love the city, and we're proud to live near the city. Our suggestion is take some time. Let Caruso go through the process that he needs to go through, see if he can get the access to the property. As has already been mentioned, there is no water, there is no sewer. It's the end of the electric line. Access is going to be extraordinarily difficult. There's a right-of-way through the bottom of my property. It's on a floodplain. There are concerns about the runoff because there is an endangered mollusk downstream. When you start building, when you start digging things up, it changes the nature of the water. Park and Planning is looking at all of this. Nothing is a done deal yet. Why don't you let the development get done if it's going to be done? There's no law that says that you have to annex now. You can wait. You can see whether or not, thank you. You can wait and see whether or not they get the approvals. You can wait and see what they put up. And at that point, you can make an evaluation whether or not to annex in. Once you say yes to annexation, you're stuck. And if you don't like what's going on, and if you aren't able to come to terms with the annexation process, if you find out that you're suddenly responsible for maintaining Lloyd Station Road because the county isn't willing to plow quickly enough so that the Pecan Ridge development can get plowed by the city plows, if there's a problem with flooding over the road and you've annexed that project and you're responsible for dealing with all of that flooding, why don't you wait and see? You got time. Just a suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you. Next I have is Miss Marsha Solsberg. Okay. Thank you for coming out this evening, ma'am.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Marsha Salzberg. I live on Mandalay in Bowie, Maryland. And I think I just had two questions. And one is, how much money do I make as a citizen? How much money am I going to make if we annex them? I mean, he says, yes, we may make a profit, and is my taxes going to go down? Am I going to get better things? What's in it for me? We keep annexing things, and I really don't understand what's in it for me, you know? Am I going to get lower taxes? The other thing is I've just been Googling, and it looks like these are the guys that did Fairview, which is down 450, which are beautiful homes. But in times of an economic downturn, which is what we had, those homes stayed empty. And if they build a whole batch of homes and we have another economic downturn, what happens? Are we going to pay? Is it coming out of my pocket that, you know, or is it going to come out of their pocket? And so who's, you know, I'm being very mercenary. I've lived here since the inception of Bowie, and I want to know what's in it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for coming out. And last I have is Mr. Antonio Ruiz.
Yes, good evening, and thank you for letting me speak. It's impromptu. I don't have any prepared notes to speak. I appreciate Mr. Caruso for having the stakeholder meeting this week and your staff member that provided the stakeholder because it was very informative. Now, my wife and I, we've been here since 2002. I was a commuter into DC, and I would use Racetrack Road to get over to Bowie State University to take the train. So with regards to the property in question, my wife and I have very limited interest in what goes on there. We feel for the neighbors and what's going to happen there if it's developed. Our interest, after hearing at the stakeholder meeting, is we live in Saddlebrook, and what I would consider collateral damage would be. Now, for tonight, we were speaking about Pecan Ridge. We've been affiliated with that Temptation Farms since 2002. I didn't even know that it was Pecan Ridge. I don't think that anybody in the community of Bowie knows who Pecan Ridge is. When we'd go by the sign over there at 450 and Racetrack Road, it said Pecan Ridge, and most of the community members, I would venture to say, they have no idea what Pecan Ridge is. So speaking to the collateral damage, 564 Racetrack Road winds through Saddlebrook, through the old racetrack, the communities that are there, and goes down and empties out into 450 and the ancillary communities in that area. So from the stakeholder meeting, there was a lot of dialogue of the impact of the traffic over for that intersection, because my wife always, calls it at risk that, I have to zip across that intersection, and you're blindsided there, the traffic coming through. So we understand the risks and the concerns of the community members for the traffic patterns, and understanding that the traffic discussion is going to be downrange sometime. But if I have a choice between leaving there, going down 197 to get over to Giant and 450, and zipping around 564 where there's no signals except for one and maybe the speed zone up there by the school, I'd rather go 564 and avoid all the traffic. Over time, we have seen the amount of traffic build up through there. More people coming through that, through 564, going through those, through the back channel to bypass all the traffic going and coming through up to Bowie State University, to getting into their homes. When we head out, we'd rather go down 564 and avoid all the traffic as well. So you have, this route that hasn't been considered, to my knowledge, the impact that it's going to have on Saddlebrook. When the trains are coming, you can always tell when the trains are coming and going. The commuters are coming back from DC or going out, because you can't get across Racetrack Road. I mean, it takes you a while. It's not the usual flow, and over time, getting across Racetrack Road has been an impact. If you go down Racetrack Road, the route there is horrible. I mean, the potholes are just, 3 years ago, the truck that I had, it was an older truck. The A-frame broke and it just slid off the road because we hit a bump. So you look at 450 and Racetrack Road, that intersection right there, it's horrendous. It's always in a state of disrepair. So now, on conservative estimates that Bruce had mentioned, 160 vehicles, if you just multiply it by 2 vehicles per household or more, and you figure families coming and going through here, you have a significant amount of traffic that's going to be bleeding off into all the additional communities through that area. So, one of the concerns that I bring before the council is, we were looking just at one area, and we're not looking at the collateral communities and the impact that it's going to have on those communities. Because I tell you what, with enhanced traffic going through 564, it's really going to be onerous getting across there. And then what does that go? Does it mean we get signals going in there? Ms. Salzberg talked about, from a mercenary standpoint, who's going to pay for that? Is that all going to be, is the burden of all that city building or city development to facilitate the traffic? Who's going to bear that cost? Will it be solely the people from the development? Is it going to be spread across the community? Are my taxes going to go up, which I have since 2002, I've seen incrementally increase? What is going to be the impact from a mercenary standpoint on my wife and I, and also on the community that we live in there in Saddlebrook? So fiscal impact, on the community, the traffic impact on the community, and I think the broader community at large that has to deal with the traffic that goes through Racetrack Road, they should be informed, because it's Pecan Ridge. What is Pecan Ridge? This, if you canvass the city of Bowie, they can't tell you what Pecan Ridge is. And I didn't know it was Pecan Ridge until 4 months ago. And we've been here since 2002, and we've been affiliated with it. So for my wife and I, right now, unless there's something positive, we don't really endorse the development in another community. And one last thing, it's just an anecdotal piece of information. We came from Southern California, where it was a beautiful, Southern California was beautiful. By the time we left there, the only thing that separated San Diego from Los Angeles was Camp Pendleton. Everything else was raised and developed, and there isn't any scenic area. And you look at the, people are having to leave there because it's ill affordable. So that's the other thing that kind of drives us. We love that area. It's a beautiful area. We feel for our neighbors, but I think the impact, I just can't support it. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rez, for coming out this evening. Okay. All right, I want to declare a public hearing closed. Pardon me? City Clerk.
I'm sorry, was the name not?
No, the name was not on here, it just came up as Pecan Ridge.
Okay. I guess if
have
you don't mind, an address and see. I know there was another lady that signed up before the gentleman.
Okay, yes, ma'am. Okay, you didn't complete your name up, if you would have approached. Oh, no, ma'am, you would have, yes, ma'am, you would have to approach. So that all the viewers at home, your viewing audience will hear you, ma'am, and see you as well. Okay.
And if you don't mind, please stating your name for the
Yes, you would state your
record.
name and address for us, because we
Gwendolyn
didn't.
Morgan is 8504 Normal School Road in Bowie.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. You may continue.
Okay. The gentleman on the end said that they weren't quite where the road situation is, but I really need to address where I am. I'm sitting dead in the middle, bullseye. I'm on the triangle lot that comes Lloyd Station, Normal School, and 564. And I don't know how they're going to do this with the 2 lanes. Like, well, it's the same thing what they say about the road, but the thing is, I got one in, one out in front of my house, one in, one out on the side, and the same thing on the other side. And I'm kind of like, are they going to have to widen the road?
Well, we'll hear from the developer again.
What?
Mr. Mayor,
pardon me. Yes,
I don't
Mr.
think the developers have gotten that level of detail yet, but am I right? Yeah.
Mr. Maynard, am I saying the right name, the guy on the 2nd or 3rd floor in the building?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, he said tonight that they would maybe have a little more information.
That's correct. That's correct.
So
Okay.
I'm not getting it.
Okay, well, we will take your questions and get those answered by the developer.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
And then he's coming back up.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming out. Okay, I'd like to declare public hearing complete. And I'd like to hear from my colleagues here in the council. If you have any questions of the developer, if you wish to approach, yes. And the council will then, questions from my colleagues? Yes. Mr. Estev, Councilmember District 1. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mayor Pro Tem. I appreciate your filling in tonight for our mayor.
Well, thank you, sir.
For those who aren't aware, the mayor's wife, Jackie Robinson, not to be confused with a baseball player, is having knee surgery tonight, not related to baseball. And so unfortunately, it was a late surgery, and the mayor's with his wife. And I believe, in the mayor's defense, in his 28-year career, this is only the 2nd meeting he has missed. So I think we'll forgive him this one tonight. I could be wrong. That's what he told me, but I'll quote him on that. I appreciate the representatives from Caruso being out tonight. I appreciate your willingness to make yourselves available for a stakeholders meeting. I had the opportunity to view it on YouTube with the rest of Millennial Bowie and read through the meeting notes. And I just have 3 questions. I know that we're early in the process, And I know that as far as road access and a lot of the details, we won't be discussing that until a preliminary plan is subdivision. And I know that Ms. Nebeski and the many residents who asked excellent questions tonight will be back for those for certain, for more dialogue. But I do want to reiterate, I guess suppose then, this is less of a question than a comment, that the road access off 11th Street is definitely going to be a major concern for residents already on there. I don't know if you've had the opportunity to see, but I'm on 11th Street all the time, and especially at rush hour. It's a narrow road. People use it as a cut through to get from 193 to 197 and racetrack and 301 roughly. So that's definitely going to be something we are looking at very closely. So just as a friendly heads up, we're going to be very interested in plans for safe travel from your potential new development onto 11th. Again, this is probably more of a comment than a question, I'll say that up front, but I am a little bit concerned about the existing neighbors, especially given that they're engaged in rural activity. When my community, Northridge, was annexed and built in 1990, it was built around an equestrian park, and at the time a lot of people said, oh, the equestrian park and the residents are going to have a lot of fights, and sure enough they were right. And as the equestrian folks remind us all the time, they were there 50 years before we were, and as we remind them, well, we don't really, we just kind of yell incoherently whenever we have to mow our lawns and they're doing equestrian things. The third one, someone brought up the timing. We've been in good economic times for 9 straight years. We pray it continues indefinitely. We know in our minds that that's not likely. And so we are, I am just a little bit concerned, and I don't know what can be said to assuage this concern, but it is in the back of my mind that 9 consecutive years of growth are wonderful, and we pray for 9 consecutive more, but we know that that's not too likely, and the possibility of a downturn to the next year to 5 years makes me a little bit nervous, given the sheer amount of new development that's being planned in and around Bowie. 1,900 units south of us on 301, 1,300 at Melford, 400 at Amber Ridge, and now potentially 80 new homes. Granted, a very small project right at home. That does make me just a tad bit nervous, so I just throw that out there. I suppose in that litany there really aren't any questions, since I think everything was kind of addressed in the meeting minutes, but those are my concerns. I saw someone writing notes, and so I appreciate talking more about that in the near future.
Sure. Well,
thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Steph, and I'd like to hear from Councilmember DeBoer, District 2.
Thank you. Again, thanks for coming out. Appreciate you taking the time. Thanks for the session that you held last week. I know that it's early, but even at this stage, you probably have some ideas of how you might tackle some of these challenges. And I'm curious to know what you've got in mind. There is clearly a floodplain issue down at the bottom of that property where the access is to the road down there at the southernmost part there. From past experience, not asking you to go out to an engineering study and commit to anything, I understand where you are in this process. Well, how does one get over an obstacle such as that?
Well, which, are you referring to the road that stubs at the bottom?
Yes, what would become the access point? Because
you mean, so you're talking about northeast corner?
Right in there, right there.
Yeah.
Access to...
Well, we have discussed that with preliminarily with staff at the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission, and of course with your city staff as well. And we are certainly, it is permissible to have a crossing of that nature. And I believe our crossing is going to be above the flood level in any event. And so that is very typical and very much allowed. Now, all that being said, we will have to have an approved stormwater management plan so that we do not increase runoff in a way that's going to cause any problems on any adjoining property. Your city, if we annex into the city, your city staff's going to be very much involved in that process. If we don't, then staff at the county is going to be very much involved in it, Department of Inspections and Enforcement for Prince George's County. But we have to go through that process. We have to have an approved sediment and erosion control plan for development purposes to make sure that we don't have runoff problems during construction. I mean, these are, I appreciate the concerns that have been articulated, but these challenges are of a type which are very normal in the development industry, and very normal for an experienced builder like Caruso Homes to be able to deal with successfully without having any adverse impact on the community. These are not extraordinary problems. We have not done a traffic study yet. However, after the stakeholders meeting, we did have our traffic engineer go out and look at the intersections in question. He's coming up with some preliminary suggestions, but definitely feels that access will be achievable and provide sight distance as required under the respective codes in both directions, coming in, coming out, looking both directions down the road. So, we think that there are no challenges here which we're not able to deal with successfully without an adverse impact. It's something that these folks do every day.
Fair enough. Next question for you. It's been mentioned a couple of times here this evening. The inevitable, shall we say, conflict between the existing property owners and users of the properties around this particular parcel. Invariably, it's going to come along, and you get suburban next to to what amounts to a farm use. What sort of measures have you taken in the past, or could you commit to, sort of easements or protections are there for ensuring that the presence of this development doesn't alter the lifestyle or uses of the surrounding properties?
Right. Well, I might want to ask either Mr. Caruso or Mr. Garrett to maybe address that a little bit, but let me say preliminarily. We're going to go through a process of a preliminary subdivision plan hearing. We have a landscape manual that we must apply to any development which requires setbacks and buffer areas between adjoining uses based upon, the landscape manual labels things as high intensity, low intensity, medium intensity, and you have to, if you're going to develop property next to an adjoining property, then the two properties are evaluated, and then your development is gauged, and you have to provide buffer areas based upon that. The second thing I'd say in that regard is the very nature of a conservation subdivision. There are some significant natural features on the property which we want to preserve, which is going to create a sense of openness within the community. That's why they allow you to have the individual lots to be smaller, down to 6,500 square feet, so that you can preserve view sheds into the property and preserve significant features. So to the north, we have a sensitive environmental area that includes a stream, some floodplain, and what we call PMA, primary management area. Same thing to the south. So we have a farm to the north and a farm to the south. And there are areas which simply will not be developed to the north and the south because we have sensitive environmental features up there. The balance of it becomes really community development, and how you site your homes, the landscaping that you install, how you lay out your roads within the community. But look, here's the fundamental reality. I'm sure that the folks that live around this property would prefer if nothing happened. At the same time, the person who owns the property today, it is zoned RR. It is intended that it will or can be developed. It's not in an OS zone or an RA zone that requires 5-acre and 2-acre lots. I mean, it can be developed today with 20,000 square foot lots. It is in water and sewer category 3, which is the county's designation for a project that is intended to be served by public water and sewer immediately, as soon as the infrastructure is extended to the property. So there are no approvals to go through to get water and sewer other than to go to Washington Suburban Sanitary Commission, get the plans approved, and extend the lines as part, of course, of the overall development approvals. So it's the never-ending tug that you experience when some people living around property just don't want anything to happen. And I respect that. I respect that view. I understand that view. But I guess that's the whole balancing of land development, and also respecting the rights of the current property owner who has a right to do something with it that the zoning permits.
And I understand that, and those are fair and valid points. But, having been around, I never lived on a farm, but I've been around farms and drive down the road, and when they've been spreading manure. And, that's just the nature of the business. And you run into these conflicts where people find themselves in a situation where someone moves to the end, in a flight pattern for an airport. Airport's been there since the 1930s, and then with righteous indignation, they complain about the noise from the planes. And, and that leaves us with the burden of dealing with that problem. And, without any, I'm trying to find some way to mitigate those issues and putting some of the burden on the future owners of those properties, as opposed to having the burdens reside solely on the outnumbered remaining last farm standing sort of deal. And I recognize the whole zoning aspect of it, but I also recognize that at some point in time, someone comes in and says, I can't stand the smell of this stuff. And I'm wondering if you have any past experience with how you could mitigate some of that.
Well, I mean, mitigate, I don't, if you mean deodorize?
No, I mean.
Of course not.
No.
That's not happening.
No, I don't think that's happening.
But listen, I was the attorney for Fairwood, and when that property was being zoned and developed. And so we had the issue that you mentioned with the flight path for Freeway Airport. So the homeowners association documents and the contracts were required to make reference to the existence of the airport. Now, does that mean that someone who moves in there is not going to complain? No, it doesn't mean that. But what it does mean is that there's due notice that's given. The developer and the jurisdiction have been diligent in providing that notice, and if a person chooses to complain about it after the fact, there's really very little you can do. But certainly something of that nature is what can be written into the contracts for the sale of homes here and into the homeowners association documents as well. Each person gets a copy of those, anyone who's buying a home. And again, that's really part of the value if we're going to go through this process. And bear in mind, you're not making, as you well know better than I, you're not making a decision to agree to an annexation tonight. You're making a decision as to whether or not it makes sense to continue moving forward with the exploration of the annexation. But as you run through the annexation process, as you negotiate an annexation agreement, these are the very types of things that get addressed in an annexation agreement and included in documents that are subsequently adopted. And with regard to the pace of the annexation, again, perhaps the annexation doesn't have to become effective until after the subdivision is approved. But typically, and I've been involved in numerous negotiations for annexation, and in particular 3 within the last 2 years up in the city of Laurel. And typically, the value of the annexation agreement is that the municipality normally has its own standards that relate to certain things. For example, here you have your own road standards that are different from the county's road standards. And so there is a value to be able to design the community, if there's a thought to annexation, to incorporate your road standards into our layout, because those are the kinds of things you have to show at preliminary plan stage. So while you're not making a decision tonight, what we're saying is we think it makes sense for both parties to explore this further and take it the next step down the road.
Question on the conservation model and moving forward with this sort of plan. At what point can that be changed? At what point can you say, you know what, looking at the way things lay out, we started out looking for this conservation model, and we've been at it for 6 months, a year. We've developed various plans, and we've changed our minds. At what stage are you in effect locked in to living to that standard, as opposed to, let's make it a more traditional 20,000 square foot lot, line them up, put one row in this way and another row that way?
Well, let me say that my client, first of all, conservation subdivision is not easy. That's why there have been so few. However, when my client sat down with his civil engineers and they looked at this property and they saw this pecan grove and they saw the view sheds, they said, you know what, this makes sense for this type of development, even though their density is not going to increase beyond what it would have been under conventional development scenarios. And so they, I mean, believe it or not, you know, developers are also stewards of the land, and they really think that this makes sense, and they want to pursue it. And so if they can get it approved this way, then they're going to develop a conservation subdivision. And so we're in a sketch plan stage right now, which is basically the staff and the planning director at Park and Planning saying, okay, there's 15 checklist items for a conservation subdivision, and for a sketch plan, you've met 12 of them, make changes to meet the next 3. So you get all the check marks checked off. They like the concept. So the planning director says, okay, we're going to say you've passed the sketch plan stage. At that point, my client would file a preliminary subdivision plan, which would be laid out and developed in concert with the approved sketch plan. The sketch plan gives you no rights whatsoever. It gives you no lot yield. It gives you nothing. It just says you're on the right track. So we would file a preliminary subdivision plan that meets the conservation subdivision requirements. And I mean, I don't know that any developer would go through the entire subdivision process, get a conservation subdivision approved, and then say, I'm going to throw all that time and capital investment away and go another direction. So my client is very intent in moving in this direction if we can. And of course, that's also one of the negotiating items in an annexation agreement.
Now tell me, in terms of what are the advantages to the builder for a conservation plan of this nature? My assumption was that closer proximity between the buildings makes it cheaper to run utilities and cheaper on the road construction. Is that true, or are there any other things?
You know what? That's a question beyond my expertise, and I'd like to have Mr. Caruso come up and answer it. Mr. Jeff Caruso, he'd be the best person to give you that response.
Hello, Jeff Caruso, Caruso Homes. It definitely uses your resources in a better fashion, such as, electric, sewer, water, and it's what, the whole United States, in fact, the world, is trying to move toward, and that is, more dense construction, because not only is it for, the efficiencies, but it's also, they feel that people these days, it's better psychologically, because people these days are spending so much time in the house, on a computer, and this, by having people closer together, they tend to intermingle more, and that's the kids and the parents. So it's really the wave of the future. But yes, it would be more efficient for the city and for Caruso Homes, and all the utilities and everybody.
Does the county provide any other benefits to you
in this?
By pursuing this?
No, I mean, what we wanted to do, we build all over, and we build a lot of very big homes. And the costs of those homes are just getting so unreasonably high that if we did the much larger lots, the only way then we're going to be doing bigger houses, the prices are really getting, it seems like they're getting beyond what people can afford, especially with interest rates going up. So I think that we wanted to do, a smaller product in here. So, it all fits with the smaller lots, the smaller product, and then we can save the, the view sheds and some of these items. So, I mean, it seems to me, we're trying to do it as a win-win, and, that's been our plan from the beginning.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wolfley. I'm now going to hear from my council colleague, Mr. Trout, District 4.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor Pro Tem. Staff have a couple questions. We heard from the applicant about this conservation sketch plan, and the applicant also mentioned a cove of the Pecan Cove, which was being saved, and as a result of that, they would be able to do 80 homes, 80 lots, 6,500 approximately square foot buildings is what I have. On this feature here, staff, do you know, with regard to the sketch plan, since this allows them to do more homes, I'm trying to ascertain if in fact they didn't use that sketch plan and they went the conventional way, what's the number of homes we'd be talking about?
Well, Dr. Trout, I believe that is part of the exercise that they have to go through in getting a sketch plan approved. They have to show the Park and Planning Commission what the alternative would be under conventional. In no case would the density be any different. The zoning determines the density. So you have 40 acres at 2 units per acre, so the maximum what you could get would be 80 units under either scenario. So that's the exercise of doing a conventional layout, I think, is something that the Park and Planning Commission has to look at as part of this process.
Okay, let me see if I understand. I thought I heard earlier that they were able to do 80 lots because they were using the conservation sketch plan, and since they were saving the code, that gave them the opportunity that they could do more lots. You just told me, at least I think you said, that if they went the conventional way, they still could do 80 lots. So I'm trying to...
More or less. It's, I don't mean to answer Mr. Meyer's question, but the RR zone, which is what this property is zoned,
right,
it allows homes to be constructed on 20,000 square foot lots.
Right.
An acre of land is 43,000 square feet and some change. So theoretical density in the RR zone is 2 units per acre, which times 40 acres is 80 lots.
Okay, so basically there's really no difference in the number of lots regardless of which way you're going.
Right, and look.
So I didn't need to have that information kind of like clouded in my mind, because I'm internalizing it. Oh, well, they can do 80 lots because they're doing us a great service here because they're saving the codes and whatnot. But if you do conventional, it's still 80 lots. So
it's going to be roughly the same. And listen,
I got it. I'm just trying to figure out where the savings was, and I don't see the savings.
And Councilman, I would also note that we're proposing 80 lots under a conservation subdivision. No guarantee we're going to get 80 lots. You know, staff, either your staff or Park and Planning staff may say, knock these two off and knock these two off. We don't like this, we don't like that. You know, but we think we're going to come in somewhere not too far below that number. But we think we could come in not too far below that number or at that number, whether we go conventional or with conservation.
I got you. I was just trying to clear up. I was under the impression that since we were going, I probably heard it wrong. I thought I heard that since we're doing the conservational sketch plan, you could do 80 lots, but you could do 80 lots because you're saving the cove, and as a result of that, you had more opportunity to do more. But it's actually the same. It's 80 lots regardless if you go.
Roughly the same, yes.
Right, okay, I got that. There was one of the residents under citizens participation, or really, I mean, under a public hearing, one of the residents spoke on a floodplain, well, not floodplain, but runoff. And they also referenced Ellicott City. I happen to know that area very well. I served that community, you know, when I was working, and for my company, I covered that particular area. And we know that they've had a couple of floods there at Ellicott City. Now, What I was told, and this is not the most recent flood, but the flood that happened just prior to that, there were some additional homes that were built at Ellicott City up on a hilly area on the backside, going towards on the Baltimore side. And as a result of that, you had a lot of rain, which we've had here, and as a result of the lot of rain that was there, the roots were very loose, the trees, they were saturated. So consequently, that was one of the conditions, one of the reasons for the flood that had, not the most recent one, but the one that happened before that, that was given as a cause for why they had the flooding. So if we got runoff in this particular area, how are we going to take care of that?
Well, perhaps, I don't know, maybe our civil engineer can answer that with a more technical answer than I can give, but I mean, part of the design of a stormwater management plan is that you cannot allow the way stormwater plans are designed today, you use methods, whether it's detention or bioretention, where the water percolates through into swales and then goes into the ground. But you are not allowed, and the government reviews and approves this, you're not allowed to have runoff which increases beyond as the site exists today, the volume.
Phil Hughes for the record, with Rogers Consulting. Technically, the way the new stormwater management manual was designed in 2007 was that your site has to mimic in runoff conditions a site that's wooded and in good condition. So technically, with this site and the way that it is now, and it's grazed, it's low grass, you're actually going to probably see a decrease in runoff from what you would get from the proposed development. And a lot of that is done through, as Mr. Gibbs was saying, microbiome retention, swales, and these are actually stormwater management facilities these days that actually provide habitat. It's not just the old days where you had a pond, you dumped all the water in it, it sat there and, you know, just roared out at a higher rate than what it was actually raining. So it actually caused downstream erosion. So these actually create habitat and, you know, actually are benefits to actually the environment by increasing runoff into the water table and things of that nature.
Okay. All right, thank you. Staff, I keep hearing about the WB&A trail. Can staff educate me as to, is there a problem? I've heard some problems that the residents have articulated. Are you aware of any problems with regard to the WB&A trail, the access? I heard something about the access would be dramatically reduced or diminished as a result of this product. What say staff?
Well, I'm not aware of any current problems with the trail. The Park and Planning Commission paved the trail. They improved it.
I mean, with the event of this, with adding this particular development. I'm not talking about it now. I'm talking about with adding the development.
That trail is adjacent to this property, so this property is not going to impact the ability of people to use that public trail. What we're hoping is that at some point in the future, there could be some type of a stop or a rest area for the people who use the trail to be able to stop, say, at the Pecan Grove and make that a public spot where they might interact, and maybe we could put some information there about Old Town Bowie and have the, you know, for tourism purposes, and have the users of the trail come up into the city. So we think there's opportunities there to even further enhance that, but I don't see any conflicts with this, the ability of users to continue to use the trail once the subdivision is built.
Okay. Have we researched, do we have any numbers? Don't necessarily have to have the numbers tonight, but I want to know, do we have the numbers in hand, or are we about to get the numbers? You had mentioned something in your address earlier. I don't recall the exact phrase that you used, so I'm going to reword it. I'm going to call it return on city services. I know that's not what you called it, but that's exactly what we're talking about here. And when I mean that, when I say that, I mean, what is the return of the impact on city services? And I'm just going to give you a couple, i.e. public works, police, and other city budget areas. How is this development going to impact on our budget?
Well, there's a general fiscal analysis that we use when we look at any annexation, and it's prepared by our budget office in the city, and they look at the rates for each service versus the revenue based on the expected sales price of the homes. And so you do a comparison of how much revenue would be generated on a per unit basis versus what the services would cost on a per unit basis, and you compare the net result. And we did that preliminary analysis, and we believe that in this case it would be a positive fiscal outcome.
Okay, so you actually have the values that the homes are actually going to be sold at?
Yes, you have to assume a value in order to do the calculation.
Those values are in the packet there.
Okay.
Dr. Stroud.
With regard to the annexation, let's see. We're not voting on doing any annexation tonight.
No, the only thing we want, in accordance with our CIP and the direction we got in the council in the past, we were encouraged to look at annexation opportunities that fit within the policy parameters that you all assigned us. This particular project falls into that category. The reason we brought it here tonight was to get some direction for you all whether to continue with this process or to set it aside and do other things.
Okay, now if we continue with the process, that was my understanding, and thank you for the answer, Mr. City Manager. That was my understanding. To continue with the process, basically all we have to do is tonight is say we're interested in looking into this further. That's all we need to say.
That's correct. That's what I need from the majority of you.
Okay. Because my way of thinking, one of the residents mentioned earlier about why are we trying to annex tonight. I think that's what she thought we were trying to annex tonight, and I knew coming into the meeting we weren't trying to annex tonight. We wanted to have this discussion to see if we wanted to proceed further on this discussion. So that's what we're supposed to be doing tonight. Yes. And my way of looking at it is if we do decide to continue this discussion further, I would think that we probably need to have some more information and even a bill from the builders before we do the annexation. There's really no rush in order to do the annexation up front, unless I'm missing something. I mean, we can look at doing the annexation, but we don't necessarily have to do the annexation before anything is built. Is that correct?
That's our prerogative.
Right.
Yes.
And we could annex it after.
That's possible too.
And we could set stipulations that a certain percentage of homes completed, then we could talk about annexation. We could do that as well, right?
We could do that. One of the things that, that would concern us from a staff perspective, you mentioned the impacts on public works and other city services.
Right.
When the construction of the roads occurs and the construction of the stormwater management plan and projects that's submitted, we would like to be able to influence that using a leverage of, city property and city jurisdiction. Okay. So that's one of the things we'd have to consider along the way.
Okay, so if you had an annexation in progress, you would be able to do that. But if you didn't have an annexation in progress, but you were in the discussion of having annexation, would you still be able to have that control?
It's possibly. I mean, we could always work something out, but it would be. I would think from a business perspective, the developer might want to have a more solid agreement with the city before they modify the construction of streets and roads and things like that. But I think that's all doable in the standard process the way we have with other development projects.
Okay, because one of the things that I was concerned about was what I'd heard earlier from some of the residents, and they were talking about having problems traveling on a particular street when you had snow removal. The street's supposed to be narrow, and also they had mentioned the construction vehicles, and when you have construction vehicles, you know, you have problems there because you're generating additional traffic, construction vehicles, also the different mud and all that other stuff that you're going to see on the ground.
The runoff issues and the issue of soil erosion, the state of Maryland has standards for construction related to that. So the construction operation would have to be in compliance with that. And if, of course, we were involved, we'd ensure that was the case.
Okay.
And I'm sure that their experience that building and construction and minimizing the effect on other neighborhoods, I think we could all work that out too, if the council wants us to go forward.
Okay. Now, I do have a question, just for clarification, and this is on the word density.
Right. I'm sorry, sir.
I have a clarification. This is on the word density. Before the council meeting tonight, I was under the impression that when we were talking about density, you're talking about, when you see more density, you're talking about more people, more vehicles, and when you're talking about more people, more vehicles, when you have more density, generally you see increases in traffic patterns and traffic.
Yes, that's true.
Is that correct?
That's
because I didn't get that from what I heard earlier. Because I heard more density is good.
Well, I mean,
and I wasn't under the impression that more density is good.
What he was referring to was the building styles and trends of the day, I think. But naturally, if you add 80 houses to a neighborhood, there'll be more traffic.
That's what I thought.
And that will be something we would have to manage.
Right.
On the negative side of it, if we are not involved and they build it anyway, we wouldn't have any way of controlling or mitigating the effect of the traffic on Old Town Bowie and that sort.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Thank you.
And Councilman, I would add as well that when we go through the preliminary subdivision plan process, we have to prepare what's called a traffic impact analysis that is scoped. If we're in the city, it's scoped with the city. It's also scoped with park and planning. And we have to put the traffic that will be generated by the subdivision into the road network, count the trips that are out there, throw the new trips into those counts, and see how that impacts the level of service. If you don't pass, you don't get approved. It's level of service D is the passing level. If you don't pass, you don't get approved. Or if you have a problem, you have to make road improvements that get you to the acceptable level of service. So we don't, any development is going to bring more new cars, but that's not necessarily a situation that's going to be bad if the improvements are made to accommodate the cars.
No, I'm familiar with that process. Maybe I misunderstood what Mr. Caruso said. I thought I heard Mr. Caruso said more density is good. And more density is not necessarily good. It depends upon the eye of the beholder.
Yeah, I think
because when you talk, let me finish, please.
Yes,
when you're talking about more density, I happen to know you're talking about more people. When you talk about more people, you're talking about more cars. You're talking about more cars. You're talking about additional traffic. So that's what I was internalizing that he said. Maybe he didn't say it. I just internalized it differently. I'm addressing it up front because I want to make sure that the audience at home understands what we're doing. I understand the process.
Okay, sir, I apologize.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Trout. I'd like to now hear from my colleague, Jimmy Marcos.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor Pro Tem, or Acting Mayor, sir. I'd like to thank you, the applicant, everyone for being here tonight, and thank you, staff, for doing a good job. Most of my questions have been answered. I share the same concerns that my colleagues do. I was just curious if staff or our attorney has anything to add that maybe we've missed, or any concerns that Mr. Minard or.
No, the only point that I was going to make has to do with the question Dr. Trout raised relative to the timing of the annexation. And there's always a question, the annexation can't proceed without the consent of the developer, obviously. So there's a question for you about the timing of the annexation relative to the willingness of the property owner to come in. And you just need to keep that in mind.
Okay, thank you. I really have no more questions. Again, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Marcos. Well, I want to thank you guys for coming out this evening myself. And like my colleagues, I totally am 100% in agreement with some of their questioning and their concerns, and definitely with the residents here in the city of Bowie and outside surrounding the city. Now, one area that I do want to say personally to Mr. Caruso, I want to applaud you for coming out this evening and being with your organization and being the representative of your actual organization. Rarely do we see the developer himself come out and speak in front of the council and meet with the residents. So I applaud you for that. And I myself, I happen to be very familiar with your project and your product. It's a very fine product that you have in the community. I've seen a number of your homes that you've built, and it's a very good product. And I would like to say, you know, if we're going to start this dating, as we're saying, because we're not marrying tonight, we're just dating. And if we're gonna date, you know, I like to date with someone who has a good car, a good apartment, okay, a number of fine items, and I am impressed very much so with your product. And there are a number of concerns that our residents voiced this evening that do, you know, raise a red flag, and this is part of the dating process, is that we find out if it's going to be a marriage, if it's going to work. So I myself am going to say that I would like to move forward with discussions of an annexation agreement and seeing, you know, this project come into fruition. I myself, but you know, I do want to see many of the concerns of our residents addressed, and then being that it's in a, you know, we talked about flood zones and we talked about elevation, we talked about a number of things of that nature this evening, you know, that raise red flags. But I'm sure if we do move forward, I'm sure that many of those issues will be resolved. But again, I want to thank you, Mr. Caruso, for coming out this evening on a personal note. And now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Mr. Estev, the council member representing District 1.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mayor Pro Tem. I would like to make a motion tonight to direct staff to begin the process of annexation after we have reviewed and voted on a preliminary plan of subdivision for the project.
Second.
Okay, what was that? Could you repeat that again?
So the motion would be to direct staff to begin the process of reviewing an annexation possibility with the developer, but only after we have reviewed and voted on the preliminary plan of subdivision.
Okay, and we have a second from Mr. Wolfrey. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Yes, Mr. Marcos.
Joe, could you kind of give us a little defining issue, if that affects anything, or if that's okay?
Well, what we were hoping from you tonight was your policy direction to move forward, not as concerned about the timing. I don't think that really hurts anything. We can still have the discussions, the negotiating, and in fact, I think as we get closer to preliminary plan, a lot of the answers to the kinds of questions that have come up tonight, we'll have those answers. We'll be able to bring that information back to council, and then you can start to shape the parameters of the actual agreement that we're going to make. And so it doesn't hurt anything necessarily. We were just looking for a positive direction from the policy standpoint, and I think the motion still does that.
Okay, so I have a first and a second. Mr. Trout?
Mr. City Manager, what is your position?
The concerns that were presented this evening by the people in the vicinity of the development are standard concerns. These are traffic concerns, stormwater management concerns, issues that always come up in any development. My position is that we have the staff, we have professional engineers, we are prepared to ensure that if this project becomes a part of the city of Bowie, all those issues will be concerned, addressed, and mitigated if necessary before we make a recommendation to you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I have a first and a second.
Yes.
Okay, so, I'm sorry.
Just take,
All in, okay, I'm going to call for the vote. All right, all in favor? No? All in favor? So I'm in 4 to 1. All right. Thank you very much. Motion carries 4 to 1.
1 second, who was the fourth and who was the nay?
The nay was Ike Trout.
I'm the nay.
Okay, thank you.
Not against the project, but
Okay, the motion carries 4 to 1. All right, thank you all for coming out this evening. Thank you, Mr. Caruso, again. Thank you very much for coming out. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. All right. Item next. South Lake Carrington Tax Increment Financing Application.
Good evening, Mayor Pro Tem, members of the Bowie City Council. For the record, Daniel Mears, Assistant City Manager. We are talking this evening in regards to the South Lake Tax Increment Financing proposal. The city received a TIF application at the end of July, and under which we have been in review of that tax increment financing application. I'm joined this evening by Jennifer Dirksen. She's the city's financial advisor with Davenport & Company. Also joined by Lindsay Rader. She's the city's bond counsel with the firm of Funk & Bolton. The City Council did hear a preliminary plan proposal on the South Lake project at its last meeting. This tax increment financing proposal is also submitted to Prince George's County, and the application itself is intended to be a joint tax increment financing project between Prince George's County and the city of Bowie. The staff had adopted TIF guidelines for TIF applications in 2015, and the packet of information you had received stepped through a review of the TIF application in consideration of those guidelines. I did want to provide a little bit further information in regards to what was included in the packet. The TIF bonds themselves would be used to fund public infrastructure improvements. Those would be to Route 214, Old Central Avenue, Route 301, the main loop road in the project, and also lake improvements. These are items that have been under discussion with Prince George's County and the developer relative to which public improvements could be included for the tax increment financing. Associated with that, the developer hired a firm called MuniCap, and they have been preparing a number of financial projections. The ones included in the TIF application that you've received are numbered 34B, so that is the 34th and the Bth iteration of all of those financial projections that they've been working on. The projections have a number of assumptions associated with those. Those include the development timeline, interest rates, participation rates from the county and the city in regards to the funding from the tax increment that could be applied to the bonds themselves. Also, the projected property assessed values and current property tax rates for both the city and the county associated with the project. As I mentioned, the TIF bonds would be issued through Prince George's County. So Prince George's County would ultimately be the lead governmental entity associated with this. And as such, the city of Bowie would not be pledging its full faith and credit to these bonds. The pledge associated with this TIF application, this proposal, would just be for the increment of improved real estate taxes associated with the project. Thank you. Okay. Included in the projections, the bond amount and payment schedule assumes that 75% of the available increment associated with the project would be used to repay the bonds. So that is the projection based upon the development, that 75% of the TIF revenue would be needed for repayment of the bonds. It is assumed that up to 100% of that increment could be used for bond repayment. That really ends up being the limit of the exposure that the city would have to the amount of dollars necessary for repayment of the public infrastructure bonds. One of the other elements included in this is a proposal that Prince George's County would establish a special taxing district. And the idea behind the special taxing district is that if for whatever reason the development were not to advance and there would not be sufficient tax increment generated by the project, that the special taxing district would levy a special tax again on the property owners that would then be used to fund the remainder of the bond associated with that. Also included in the development, I had mentioned that the real estate property taxes would be what the city would pledge. The city would have additional revenue that would be available to the city during the life of the bonds. These would include surplus incremental real estate taxes, hotel motel taxes, income taxes, motor vehicle taxes, cable franchise fees, and state shared police revenues. Included in your packet was also a fiscal impact memo. The city staff had undertaken a couple of different approaches to analyzing the impact on services in terms of the costs and expenses associated with it. And in those two approaches, we had a different look. The planning department had reached out to all of the departments to get an estimate based upon the development timeline of the cost of providing services in the first few years of the project. The finance department did a linear projection. The way they approached the linear projection was taking a look at the cost of services in terms of based on our current budget and the number of households within the city of Bowie today, and projecting that out as the development were to occur. So it was really a linear straight line projection. Included in your memo, we took a look at 2 points in time associated with those projections. The first point in time was really looking at the long view. The long view associated with the project was what the project would look like to the city at the end of the repayment of the debt. Associated with that, the project would be projected after build out to generate $7.1 million in additional revenue to the city. And the associated expenses with the project would be about $3.4 million per year. So at the end of the project, once the bonds are all retired and the project is fully built out, it would net the city about $3.6 million in additional revenue per year. That would translate to a little bit more than 2 cents in future value of tax rate for the city of Bowie. The second look that we had was in regards to the short view. I'd mentioned the city staff had looked at projecting expenses a few years out. So we looked at the end of 2025. And at the end of 2025, the reason we looked at that was there was a significant amount, but not all of the development associated with the project projected to be built out. So it would be anticipated that the development, the bonds would still be being repaid. The majority of those dollars would be going to the project, but we would have a significant impact on city services. So looking at the short view, I had mentioned in regards to the revenue that there were other revenue sources in addition to police protection, funding from the state, income taxes, and other revenues. The city would also have surplus incremental tax revenues of approximately $642,000. Totaling with those other revenues, it would be about $1.4 million in revenues that would be coming in. The expenses projected by staff in 2025 was $1.5 million, so there would be a deficit of about $119,000 in year 2025. Let's see. The one other item that I wanted to point out was in regards to the projections. You will note that there is a note associated with the base value assumption for the current property. What's included in projection 34B is the assessed value of the property as of 2017. The staff believes that the correct base value should be based on 2015, which is about $800,000 less than what is included in the projection. So we do anticipate an update coming from the projection. So that is all I have for providing an overview. We are available for questions, but of course we have public hearing tonight as well.
Thank you, Ms. Assistant City Manager. Ms. City Clerk, do we have anyone sign up for public hearing to speak? Thank you, Madam Clerk. All right, good friend of mine, Al Barman. Hello, Al. Haven't seen you in a while. How's everything?
Great. Everything with you all.
Good to see you. Good to see you.
Good. Okay. You know, at its conception, tax increment financing was supposed to be a tool used by municipalities to encourage development of blighted areas or redevelopment of industrial sites. And the objective of the TIF was to provide mitigation of risk to a developer on a project that posed significant risk, and at the same time provide benefits to the municipality that is then able to develop areas that has been hard-pressed to improve. And the theory about TIFs is that the developer is being financed by increases in taxes generated from the effect of the development. However, over the course of time, prices rise on everything, and since tax increases are used to pay off the developer's financing. We just heard 75% of it would be paid off through the developer's financing. It leaves a shortfall for other residents of the community. And the other residents of the community are then required to pick up the shortfall for road improvements, sewers, schools, fire, police protection, everything. To me, building residential units at South Lake is not a project that provides significant risk to a developer, nor do I believe does it have any great benefit to the city or county. I mean, it's a development. I mean, we have those all over the place. And therefore, I see no reason why the citizens of Bowie or Prince George's County should subsidize this project. And I encourage you to vote no on any TIF financing request. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Next, Mr. Larry Swank. Hello, Mr. Swank. Good evening to you. Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you for coming out.
Thank you. We really didn't realize that this was the first public hearing. We thought that you were going to be getting information on, you know, the rest of the briefing from last week. So, excuse me if I'm not prepared. I will be next week. Okay. And as we move forward, there is. I just want to go on a very, very high level of impact, as I understand it, and then folks can correct me. But I just wanted to set the baseline. You will hear people talk about, oh, 2025, 20-something else, what's the big deal? As I read it, at least as what's been presented so far, and these numbers are really loosey-goosey because they're going to change over time. These are estimates only. And so a bunch of assumptions have been made. But basically, you've got a 30-year program where you're going to have to pay off bonds. You're going to get tax revenue from these new housing developments. And you're going to use that to both pay roughly, let's just say, a third in the improvements. You're going to pay about another third in the cost of covering the bonds, and you're going to be left with about a third over this 30-year period to actually do the things in South Lake that are the services that should be provided to South Lake. So if I'm talking $30 million to build this out, you're going to be in the $60 million range, a little above that, once you've paid the money to build it out and covered the cost of the debt. And then you're going to have about $30 million, $35 million, whatever, left over in real money, tax revenue to the city to take care of everybody in that community. Now, you've lost 2/3 of the taxes coming in to do that job. You're only going to do it with 1/3. And for that reason, you know, I don't think it's a good deal. If it's a deal at all, it should be well below the money that's initially been talked about as far as, you know, any kind of contribution. But since you all tonight are going to be basically next week, the staff will they're introducing the resolution tonight for the city's intent to approve the tax incremental funding. Next week, when you look at that for voting, that's our first chance to turn this thing down, and probably a good time to do it. So just give that some thought. That's all I wanted to really express to you. We'll have other folks coming up later on talking to you about how bad of an idea this was and why cities and counties are getting away from it and bailing out on this particular type of funding. And we don't really want Bowie to become, you know, the City Council Bank of Bowie. And just think about when this gets out to the contracting world, how they're going to look at Bowie for development. Whole different light. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Swank. Well, I'd like to declare public hearing closed. And if I could then hear from my colleagues here, anyone, and if staff would approach as well. We're going to start with council member Steph.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mayor Pro Tem. Mr. Mears, it feels like almost never 40 consecutive hours go by before we see each other, and I appreciate that. Thank you for joining us late here tonight, along with the rest of staff and our residents who are sticking around. We appreciate it, and thank you, Mr. Swank and sir, for your comments this evening. We definitely appreciate those. Very briefly, from a bird's eye level, from the exciting page turner of a document that I got to review last week, and from your presentation this evening, it looks like at this stage we can guesstimate that, you know, this project over the course of the long term will have a positive net effect on the city. That the revenue we ultimately collect from the TIF and beyond will ultimately exceed what we expect to expend as far as new services. Because we're predominantly looking at apartments and condos, there's a whole class of services that we won't even necessarily have to provide because those would be services, certain public works services that are only provided to single-family homes and so on. And I'll be honest, and now I'm going into soliloquy and moving away from questions, but not that I asked one, but I was a little bit torn. I voted against the 700 units a couple weeks ago. The added units, and, you know, part of me just really, you know, after that evening kind of said, all right, well, if this is going to happen, we may as well collect the tax revenue, because what the heck, the county likes this, we're going to have to deal with the traffic anyway. But one of the things that dawned on me as I was rereading this project and kind of looking at what a lot of our neighbor communities are doing, and this is something two of our speakers touched on tonight, is whether or not this really is the best use of a TIF in the first place. And that's something that I'm really kind of still wrestling with. A little bit. You know, you look at how Baltimore uses tax increment financing, you know, and it's to create jobs, it's to fix blight, it's to deal with a lot of systemic issues that we're really not facing. And even though we are concerned about long-term of retail, you know, there are certain other factors in that stew that we have to think about, since this is going to be on 301 and 214 with a lot of congestion, a lot of traffic. And so to me, you know, I'm still, and I'll concede, I'm still very much wrestling with that question of whether or not this is the best use of a TIF. And that's something that I'm going to continue thinking about in the coming weeks and continue consulting residents about. That being said, I appreciate your presentation. You guys have been extremely thorough. I really appreciate Mr. Henry King and all his staff scheduling so many hearings and doing such a great job giving residents an opportunity to come and speak and address us. That is very much appreciated, and I look forward to hearing from the rest of my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Estev. Now, we're going to hear from Dufour Wolfrey, District 2.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor Pro Tem. I have a number of questions regarding this matter, and I want to kind of step through, and if you got the answers, great. If not, we'll catch them later, and if it's a different venue for a different subject matter expert, that's fine too. Starting off with the page 2 of this memo here, the but-for test that's at the bottom of page 2, and it says, other avenues of financial assistance have been explored without success. And the question that raises for me is the construct of this proposed TIF. My understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, so I want clarification first, make sure I have a correct understanding, is that we have a request that's been kind of negotiated to around $33 million for the total request from the developer. Is that right?
Yes. And
that the expectation is that about a third of that would be paid back by us.
That's correct.
So in essence, we're going to take on $10 million in their building expense for them. And the other 22 or whatever million it is, it would be covered by the county. So if that is in fact the case, the question I have is, if we don't TIF, is there any reason why the county can't just handle the rest of the TIF in its entirety? They would have the same tax leverage as we would have. I mean, the tax rate is the tax rate that the county has, and I would assume that they could repay for the full 33.
As I had mentioned, there are 34 different models of this financial projection that had been there. The city has not received all of those. I don't know whether or not the developer has put forth a projection that would assume all of the debt being assumed by Prince George's County. The financial analysis ultimately associated with that would have a different coverage rate associated with it, because it would be lacking the city's revenues going into part of that TIF. So not having seen what that projection is and not knowing what the county's perspective is in regards to sufficient coverage, I wouldn't be able to have an answer for you this evening. But it is a scenario that ultimately the developer may be able to have a better answer for.
Yeah. It just seems that if we're speaking to this issue of the if-but test, when I read through our policy, the only place that we should be executing a TIF is if there's no other way for somebody developer to get financing for this. And it seems to me that that's not the case. If the county is interested in doing a TIF, they've already expressed an interest to do for $22 million, understanding that we would take tax benefit and then TIF the rest. That means that the alternative would also be viable, which is that the county could take the whole thing, and therefore there's no need for a TIF on the part of the city because they can get it somewhere else.
And given that they have submitted their TIF application to the city as well as to the county, I think that would indicate that the best scenario for them would be the participation of both. But your question is certainly a valid one that I think would be appropriately posed to the developer when they are before us to explain ultimately why they feel that this meets that but-for test as to needing the city's participation and not going just with the county.
Okay. Actually, that raises a question you mentioned in your opening remarks about MuniCap.
Yes.
Did we select them, or did the
They're selected by the developer. They're very well regarded. They're a very well-regarded financial advisory company. They do a lot of this work in Maryland and beyond.
Okay, so they are selected, and so those, we should consider those numbers as proposals strictly by them, by the developer.
Correct. That is their projections that they've put forth, but that's why we have our team here with our financial advisors to review those and get some truth testing in regards to that as well.
Yeah. Let's speak to that. And looking at the numbers that we've seen and you guys have been looking at, I have significant concerns about the projections, the expectations that this would be a viable model. We've had a long sordid history with Melford in terms of its development and what it started out as, and it's flipped around, spun around. It's been, you know, an albatross for a while, and now it's, you know, turn around, and the new developer comes in and picks it up and starts changing the whole scheme. But the long story is that, you know, if we had tiffed something like Melford, I think we would have really been out of pocket, because that project was very lengthy in coming anywhere near to fruition. And then we look at this project, and we've seen how Carrington has had a lot of fits and starts in its development history and its proposal history, and it's whether it's market conditions or sniping between parties that own or develop it. When you're looking at these numbers in that context, how do you put a risk factor in there for what happens on those bonds, you know, and the likelihood of this property actually getting developed on a time schedule that doesn't leave us holding the bag when they start off and they put out there and they say, hey, we put in these residential units, and I have a burden that's associated with those, whether it's schools. Well, we don't do the schools, but certainly the traffic, and we certainly have other issues that go in there, and amenities, services, facilities that they might require, but yet we barely have enough to cover the bonds, and not enough to cover all these extra services, mainly because the project isn't fully developed. So from a bond analysis standpoint, how do you take that into account?
Well, one of the advantages in regards to the way this is structured is it puts a lot of that burden back on the developer and ultimately on the bondholder in regards to the risk for the project. So let's assume a worst case scenario for the developer. They issue the bonds, they undertake all of the capital improvements for the public infrastructure, so the bonds are all let. The economy tanks. You know, that is just not there. There's no development associated with that. So the problem ultimately for the repayment of those bonds, no increment is being generated in order to repay those bonds. So the bondholder is sitting with a debt that they need to recoup. The way this is proposed to be structured is that a special taxing district would be overlaid associated with that. So with insufficient revenue from the increment, what would happen is that special taxing district would then levy back to the property owner, which the developer would be holding at that point, in order a special tax that would cover the bond payments. So all the while there is no development or insufficient development associated with that, the property owner is going to be having to pay a special tax for the repayment of the debt. Meanwhile, the city, from that standpoint, would not have any development or limited development associated with that. So while there would be some service delivery that would come into play, that would be a small amount of expense associated with it because there was very limited development. So as the risk for the city increases in terms of the amount of development that exists for expense for services, that also increases the likelihood that there's sufficient revenue through the tax increment for repayment of the debt.
I follow that logic, except I don't see that it manifests itself that way coming out, because the way I see it is certainly the public facilities that would end up being built, I understand that. They would need to have the road improvements and the like, and the stormwater management. And I see us letting the bonds. What I don't see is a situation, what I envision is a situation where they are able to build out the residential, yet never quite get around to the commercial side, where we've had issues in the past, where we have office space that's not filled, Class A office space that's here over at Melford that's left unfilled, where we have the potential for retail that doesn't get developed because retail market overall is in question, I think, in terms of what might end up happening. And I see ourselves in a spot where you could find a situation where you have let the bonds, and then you're in a situation where we have the service, the full service associated with the residential infrastructure, but without the benefit of the commercial side to help with the tax base. Now, I understand that if in that circumstance we can put a special taxing, but it's actually not us. It's incumbent upon the county to do that, and we're at their mercy in terms of making sure that it happens. They can negotiate that away and forestall that and say, well, we'll eat it for a little while. But the bigger concern is that they could find themselves in a position where they are bankrupt, and it doesn't matter what your special taxing district is.
Yeah.
It gets caught up in some big, litigious, quagmire about what happens to the piece of property, who claims it, who owns it, where it gets bought, and, new developer, redeveloper, and we're left with, services and bonds that need coverage, and we end up with perhaps enough money to pay the bonds, but not enough to cover the services on this. And for me, I look at this as a significant risk to the community, that we have a continuation of the demonstrated problems that we have at Melford in terms of finding suitable commercial uses for infrastructure or for development in this area.
Well, to speak to your point, whether the developer would go bankrupt, whether the county would not issue the special taxing district, under either of those scenarios, the city would not be at any increased risk in terms of the repayment of the bonds. Ultimately, that risk would be borne by the bondholder in that regard. So their return on the interest.
Only as it relates to the special taxing district, right?
Correct.
So, but if there's nobody there to pay the special tax at some point, I mean, it ultimately gets sorted out, but it's going to take quite some time to sift through that ownership and transition, right?
It certainly would. And I wanted to move along to your point in regards to the type of development and what would happen. In the projection that they included when we looked at the end of 2025, their projection had put in that 100% of the retail square footage would be in place, 50% of the office square footage would be in place, 100% of the hotel would be in place, and on the residential side, 100% of the apartments, 2/3 of the townhomes, and 40% of the single family. So that is the projection that they've put forward in terms of their anticipated development schedule at this point. I think it would be very appropriate to ask the developer when they're before us as to the basis and the rationale for why they have determined that, and the likelihood of that happening. And as we have all seen, sometimes economic situations certainly do force a hand beyond what can be anticipated, but this is the assumption that we're working on from this projection.
Yeah, and I looked through and I saw those, and that's where I had the concern. I find it very difficult, and I don't know how, from a bond standpoint, how do we, does that get addressed at all in terms of the bond analysis, or does anybody, is it more just straight up, can we have the revenue, or is there some probability of success that was considered? for payments.
And that comes in regards to the market study that they had completed associated with this project. I would imagine that they are sharing the results of that market study and that information with the prospective bondholders in that regard. They are already at the table and engaged in the conversation.
On page 4, we had at the top, first full paragraph, there is a discussion there about the projections do not include any operating costs. Can you define what those operating costs are for me?
Okay. Those operating costs are associated with the costs for providing city services. So the projection 34B does not contemplate the impact on city services and costs associated with that. So that's where we had our internal staff analysis associated with that.
Okay. Now, in this comment here, it says that we do not incorporate, we do not include any adjustment for inflation, but yet elsewhere we have inflation adjustment.
Yes. In the analysis that was conducted by our finance department, we do have inflationary aspect put into that. I believe that was a 2.6%. 2.6% inflator that we had put into the staff projections.
So, but in this, but what we're saying here in this paragraph is that the 1 million in fiscal 2019 and 560 through 2024, and then it says even if you hold these constant through the 30-year life of the bonds, operating costs would equal to almost $17 million, which would revise the city's total net tax gain to 57. So it's reducing our total net tax gain. And my concern is that understates what the cost would be because there's no inflation incorporated into that expense.
That would. And in terms of this paragraph, this is looking at over the life of the 30-year bonds in terms of what that cost is. This was looked at in a variety of different ways, so you may see a different approach in terms of how the information is stated and restated.
Because I'd like to see what the impact is if we put inflation on that.
Okay.
For those costs, because it seems to me that everything else we've got an inflation adjusted for property values going up, but we don't have inflation adjusted for the operating costs.
Okay. We'll make a note to run a new scenario to get a better estimate on that.
Okay. Is there? Okay.
No, I think we're good.
All right. The next question is, we have here a total project of $345 million.
Yes.
Of which 10 million would become ours, which means this project we're looking, I guess it's a question for the, I think that's a question for the developer.
Okay.
Or the applicant, I should say. The projections on page 5.
Okay. All right.
Go ahead. No, that's fine. If you've got more info, feel free and jump back to the other question.
I'm being advised that the operating costs are do have an inflationary factor associated with those.
Okay. All right. So that statement's incorrect. They are inflation adjusted.
Yes.
Okay. The next question I have, where was I? Oh yes, on page 5, at the bottom of the page, there's a paragraph that says, however, based on city staff's cost estimates, the city could not be able to fully support operating costs with tax increment revenues through fiscal year 2024, requiring just under $3.1 million from the general government revenues during this 6-year period. So what I interpret that to mean is that until 2024, I've got to find money to pay for this. I either got to raise taxes, or I got to cut services, or I've got to
Use fund balance.
use fund balance, which presumably is available for other capital expenditures and the like. Is that correct?
Yeah, and that is correct. In the short view of looking at this project, assuming the build-out scenario included in the 34B assumptions, there would be expenses that exceed the revenues coming in for the project. That corrects over time.
One hopes. One hopes. Well, everything goes according to assumptions. The next question I have is on page 6. It says, will the proposed tax increment financing impact the city's ability to issue other rated debt? About halfway through that first subparagraph underneath there, there is a comment that says the city's current debt burden was taken in consideration. Was there any yielding a 0.2% debt to full value? I'm sorry, it's a 0.2% rate, with the norm being 0.7.
Okay.
Now, what about the ice rink and additional basketball facilities that we've been contemplating in our capital programs? Are those factored into that 0.2%, or would that be additional bonds that would have to be?
Okay, those were not factored into this.
Okay.
And I think it'll be important to note that this tax increment financing, since it would be issued through Prince George's County, would not have an impact on our debt. So effectively, in terms of looking at that debt obligation from the city, this is not.
Well, I understand, but it does limit the availability of funds to pay the rest of our debts.
The other debt, yes.
So I understand that it's on the books for the county, but the fact of the matter is you're going to take money out of my piggy bank to pay for it, which means I don't have money in the piggy bank that could be going to pay for some other debts, whatever they might be.
Yes.
Okay. Can someone?
Jennifer has a.
And even in adding the additional debt expected for the ice rink and basketball courts, I think you would still stay within that 0.7% median. So I don't think that it would be an issue with the rating agencies. And just for reference, I used to work at Moody's so, and rate the city. So it's something that they look at and I'm familiar with. So I don't think it would be an issue from that standpoint.
But at what point, once you get past the median, does it begin to have an impact?
I would say, you'd have to be significantly over the median. I mean, 0.7 is the national median. The state median is actually higher than that. Maryland typically has higher debt medians in general. So while you might be out of line slightly with the nation, you'd be more in line with the state. So that's taken into account during rating committee.
And my concern is if there is some project or some, emergency or catastrophe or whatever that requires us to go out and, borrow a whole chunk of change, I could find myself in a position where I'm already at the median, and that additional burden could then all of a sudden become something that either puts me into a different category or at least marginally increases my cost of borrowing.
Perhaps, but take into account that a rating is more than just debt, and debt only is 10% of the rating. So it's a overview of a number of factors.
Okay. Thank you. And let's see other. The question I have, I guess the parting question, I guess it's merciful for everybody else. Last question. How do you account for risk associated with fluctuations in real estate property values? How does one account for that in terms of when we're looking at these bonds and assessing their their strength.
I think that might be an appropriate question for the petitioner when they come before us. Unicap, in terms of doing their projections, they may be able to explain their model on how they accounted for that over the life of these bonds.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you all for your patience, and thanks for the information.
Thank you, Mr. Wolfrey. Next, I'm going to ask Councilmember Trout.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor Pro Tem. Just want to focus in on pretty much the 5 objectives. The city in its TIF policy has 5 objectives identified, and a minimum of 1 must be met. All of them may not be relevant to the particular project. And this goes to staff. You've indicated that 4 of the 5 have been met. Can you tell us the significance of that? What does that mean? What does that translate into? 4 of the 5, and you got A, no, B, yes, C, yes, D, yes, E, yes. Could you give me a little insight on what's going on with that? And the no for A, is that something that is
Mr. King?
Statistically significant or something along those lines? So I know it's a lot of questions.
Mr. Trout, this is John Henry King, Economic Development Director. You are correct. Only 1 of the tests need to be met by our policy. They are basically go or no-go tests. There's no secret arithmetic that one determines. And let me go through them in order. Blight. Blight is the traditional original use of tax increment financing, as I believe Mr. Baumann mentioned. That's not a condition that exists on this property. This property is greenfield, unbuilt land. It's not a condition that exists. It's not a condition we're trying to remedy by the use of the TIF financing. No, that is not a use of this money in this project.
Okay.
Supporting neighborhood retail services. One of the things I've heard for the 18 years I've been with the city is the need for grocery shopping and other retail opportunities in the southern portion.
Amen.
This has been heightened since the closing of the Giant at Pointer Ridge.
True.
The reality of the market is there will not be a grocery store in Pointer Ridge other than that grocery selection that's offered at the dollar store. So to find a location proximate to our southern current communities, the only commercial potential property exists in the Carrington development. So the development of the commercial portion of this property will yield the grocery store that the residents in the southern part of the city are asking for.
Question.
So we say, yes, it meets our TIF test because I believe you've stated you want retail opportunities for the South, so the use of the TIF to get those would meet a yes.
Question. You're absolutely right. That is what the residents in District 4, the southern part of the city, have said. But the question is the size of the store. Do you have any, I'm not talking about, the brand name or the chain, but the size of the store. We're talking something that's in the neighborhood of what we see in the large stores, roughly 65,000 square feet. Is that what we're talking? We're talking about something a little bit small.
The stores I'm aware of that have expressed an interest of this are typical footprints equal to what one would see in a Giant, a Safeway, or a Harris Teeter. They're a modern store footprint.
Okay, thank you.
The challenge is the longer it takes for that location to come into existence, the higher likelihood that the grocery market will again change, that they will revive another location, or they may decide that they no longer want to serve anything in this area. So we have to keep that in mind.
Okay.
The next one is, does it increase the property tax base? Well, that's a yes and a no. Yes, it does, because when you finally bring this in and at the end of the life of the tax increment financing project, you have all of this developed project that is generating tax revenue. And in fact, from the day it is annexed, it will generate some money. A small number initially, but as build out occurs, there will be a greater number. For example, high likelihood there will be at least one hotel built in the early phase of this development. It will be built to serve the Liberty Sports Park, which is the soccer lacrosse complex that the county is undertaking to establish at the north edge of the Collington Industrial Zone, which just happens to be the south border of the South Lake project. That will provide a base. There is at least one hotelier who has an interest in building the hotel to capture that base. While the original application requested the use of hotel-motel tax revenue in addition to real property revenue to pay it, neither the county nor the city was willing to put that piece of revenue into the TIF payment fund. So that is a revenue source we would be receiving there. Diversity is it adds new taxpayers, new houses, new commercial to share the tax burden with the other residents. Adding this does not increase the cost to an individual resident currently in the city. It simply adds new taxpayers from whom some amount of tax revenue will be generated for use by the city.
Question. Is it possible that you could generate enough tax revenue that you could actually reduce the tax rate or not have a tax increase?
I would not think that likely.
Okay. Which one? Reduce the tax rate or not have a tax increase?
All of the above.
Okay.
Attract new and expanding services and developments and employees to the city. That's a corollary of the commercial development that will be there. They will obviously need to bring in new employees. That location may offer an opportunity for a retail concept that is new, or a service concept that is lacking in the city, or it may provide added diversity to the service base that we already have here. So yes, there's going to be an expectation of expanded services, and there will be new employers coming into the city.
Okay.
Housing choices, that's a function of the development itself. It has a mix of single family, multifamily, townhouses, condominium units. So it will be adding new housing choices into the city.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. King. So, Mr. King, my next question to you is, on page 3, when it talks about, well, let's go to page 2, the last paragraph in page 2, it has the but-for test. That's the last paragraph in page 2, but the second paragraph in page 3 does talk about the same thing. It says the application meets the but-for test. And that was a question that I heard asked earlier from one of my colleagues about, does it meet that test? And according to what I'm reading here, it is the city is satisfied with the fact that it has met that test?
Staff is satisfied it is met. Let me explain that entry. The parenthetical phrase right after the bold but-for test is the wording from our policy about the but-for test. I'm going to ask our bond counsel if she would explain briefly the subjectivity and the lack of legal definition of but-for test in the Maryland Code.
Good evening. Lindsay Rader, Funkin Bolton. In Maryland, unlike in some other states in the nation that allow TIF financing, there is no requirement that a but-for test be met in order for TIF bonds to be issued or for another entity to pledge its incremental tax revenues to support those bonds. However, the city, in looking at its TIF policy over the last couple of years and in revising it 3 years ago, thought that from a best practice standpoint, that it would be good to have the but-for test be a component of your decision-making and in determining whether to move forward with a proposed transaction or not. And so the but-for, there isn't actually a legal definition because the but-for could be very different for very different types of financings. The reasons for why the financing is needed. I mean, the question of, yes, would this project proceed without this financing, ultimately, is the sort of rubric of the but-for tests. But the reasons as to why you answer either yes or no could vary greatly depending on the type of project that is being proposed. And so that is why there isn't a specific checklist when analyzing the but-for question.
Okay. Is it your understanding that in the but-for question and the but-for test that the city is satisfied that the answer to that is yes, or staff is satisfied that the answer is yes?
My understanding is that staff is satisfied, yes.
Okay, thank you. That's all I have.
All right, thank you, Councilmember Trout. Can I also, pardon me, before, like to make a comment? Oh, no, he doesn't have anything to say.
Thank you. I want to go back to the discussion of the but-for. So if there is this ambiguity of what this definition, to me it's pretty straightforward, that without the TIF financing, this project doesn't get developed. That would be pretty straightforward. If you don't provide the TIF at present time, the project dies. That to me is but for this. And if that's not the case, what is the subjective alternative definition that's been used for the but-for test, and how did we get to that answer?
I'm not sure I completely understand your question. The city, when we adopted our TIF policy, laid out the but-for test. That's all of those words within the parentheses up there. That's what exists in our TIF policy now. That is the test we apply.
If I may clarify, what I was intending to convey is that the reasons in different transactions why you decide you have or have not met the but-for test can depend on a variety of factors. But you are correct, Council Member, the sort of idea of what the but-for test is pretty straightforward. The transaction wouldn't move forward without this financing being provided.
So to your point, the city will undertake a rigorous analysis to ensure that the city will undertake a rigorous analysis to ensure that the proposed project satisfies a but-for test. The but-for test must demonstrate to the city's satisfaction that the developer cannot obtain conventional financing at satisfactory rates and that other avenues for financial assistance have been explored without success. So the question becomes one of, how do we know that there's no other financing available, and if we to make us feel comfortable that without this TIF, it stops. Because otherwise, we're handing out money because, I don't know why, right? Because it's cheaper. Well, actually, I take that back. I do know why. Because we're paying $30 million, so they don't have to pay $30 million. So if they come and tell me that, oh, we met the but-for test, well, heck yeah, I met the but-for test, because if I tell you I met the but-for test, you give me $30 million free. And so the question becomes one of, how is it that we know that they satisfied this but-for test, and what's the rigorous analysis that says they can't get it somewhere else and pay their own freight?
And this is one of the challenges in terms of what this is looking for, because under the scenarios that have been proposed in terms of the projections and the assumptions on the project, they're going forth and seeking financing for their project. And the way you're posing the question says the ultimate way for us to know as to whether or not they meet the but-for test is for us not to enter into the TIF and see if it fails or not, if the project does not move forward. Absent that, there will always be a what if this scenario was undertaken.
Well, I disagree with that wholeheartedly. I mean, someone can show up at my door and say, look, I tried A, I tried B, I tried C, these guys turned me down, these guys are charging me usury rates, it's 38%, it's just over the top, and I've got no way of making money on this, I'll go bankrupt in three weeks. So where is it that we know that there is nobody else out there that will issue a bond? Or is
well, we're operating in accordance with Prince George's County, and we have accepted the developer's perspective that but for this financing, this project would not occur. And we have not, and nor I'm not sure we have the ability to cross-examine them or to prove them to the opposite. However, the way it stands presently, what's presented in the TIF application is the county's TIF pledging their funding, we're pledging ours, and absent that, this project may not occur. But like Daniel said, without some investigation into the county's veracity, the developer's veracity, for which I'm not sure we have the authority to do, nor the manpower to do. We're working with the Prince George's County, and we're partners with them on this. We've accepted the developer's understanding and the county's understanding that this is a requirement to get this project done.
But I want to stop right there. That's as wrong as I can be. I cannot accept that we are willing to accept somebody's blanket statement that says, I will only do this if you give me $30 million. Well, and I mean, if something is as basic as social services, someone says, I need food stamps, I need assistance with paying my bill at the electric company or whatever it is, we have requirements that say, you've got to show me that you can't pay this. So now I've got a situation where I've got a developer who wants to come in, wants $30 million. I take him at his word that he needs $30 million. Of course he's going to tell me he needs $30 million because now someone's telling me that I can't check. I got to believe that this says that there is a but-for test that has a rigorous analysis to ensure that the proposed project satisfies a but-for test. And how can I be satisfied if nobody's asked them to show me where you failed to get financing?
I understand your question now, Ms. Wolfley. That paragraph where it says, staff talked to lenders, I talked to lenders. They told me they weren't going to do this deal. That satisfies, in my mind, a but-for test. Not just one lender. I talked to over a half dozen of them. And not just local lenders, those that deal regionally and those that deal nationally in projects of this scale. So I'm satisfied that what the developer said about not being able to get money for a project of these terms was in fact an accurate statement. The second part of the but-for test is we don't get that retail we want in the South without this financing, because this project will not happen this year or next year. It's not going to get going. We'll miss another market cycle. That adds to the but-for test. The but-for test is without our money, we aren't going to get something we want. So those are the two pieces that I verified.
Also, there may be some additional, if we back out of this deal, there's nothing to prevent the developer from putting a residential out in there without the commercial connection.
Well, that's
which would
perfectly
exacerbate the situation.
But that's okay. I still have my $33 million.
Well, I mean, well, I'm talking to the council in particular. Those are the circumstances that we have. And
but this is more than just I'd like to see whatever it was, whatever the rigorous stuff is that we went through, and I'm not sure what that looks like. But the other factor is that, yes, we may not get retail. We may not get a grocery store in District 4. That's perfectly fine. At $33 million, that's a very expensive grocery store. And at $33 million and traffic and burden on my schools and burden on my city services, this is not just a simple, oh, but they came in and they would like $33 million for me to pay for this when there's no cost to them. Heck yeah, I'd show up for that handout too. So, please forgive me if I seem, a little bit upset, but I'm a little upset that I have to take it on assumption that somebody has checked for a, for the validity of the statement where nobody has presented it to me.
Well, I beg to differ, sir. Mr. King just told you what he did, and the only option is whether you accept it or not.
Yes, and I think that the point is that I just now heard that, and the assumption that somehow this is...
Well, there's been no effort to hide anything from anybody. We're putting everything out there open and public. We just told you what happened. He told you who he checked with. It's a matter of whether you accept what we say or not.
I'd like to see the information, please.
We'll write it up for you then.
Thank you, appreciate it.
All right, thank you, Mr. Wolfrey and staff. I want to hear again from my council colleague, Ike Trout.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor Pro Tem. Back on this discussion, let me jog your memory a little bit. Mr. City Manager, we had some discussions on this project several months ago. And one of the things that, correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the things in our discussion we were talking about with regard to the TIF, we were waiting on what I heard you refer to as the marketing study or the marketing package. And in that marketing package, when I was discussing with you, talking to you, I think I got the impression, I think I heard from you that what we were doing was getting figures from the developer on what it took and what they were looking for us in order to do the TIP. So my question is, in this marketing study or this marketing proposal plan that was submitted to the city, and I believe it was also submitted to the county, was not that information included in that particular piece of that documentation that the city received, city staff received?
We have gotten a marketing study. It's out of date. It came in last year, and because the project stalled, the data is no longer accurate. So there's a requirement by the developer to update the marketing data right now.
Now, in that marketing study, does that marketing study also talk about the financing?
No,
they're trying to seek?
Not so much. I mean, we've done the analysis ourselves. It mentions financing, but not in the detail that we speak of. It looks more at the possibility for success related to the hotels, the retail, and it talks about those issues as to how they believe that this commercial and residential project will be successful, with the assumptions of population and retail associated with the entire process, not so much the bond issue.
Okay, but we do have something that we can give to my colleague to satisfy him with regard to the fact that this is not a guess, that we have some documentation that suggests that this is actually needed to support the but for this.
Well, if regard to the but-for test, we can have Mr. King write up specifically who he worked with and who he checked with regard to financing.
Maybe we should do that. Maybe that will give some ease to my colleague with regard to that discussion.
The staff's prepared to do whatever the council wants on this.
I would hope that we would do this prior to the next. I hope we would get this information, if possible, in the hands of council when we do the next council package. I don't know if that's feasible, but I would hope that we could do that. But certainly, since we do have this on the agenda for, I believe it is the 11th or somewhere thereabouts, that we need to have that before we start to talk about this at the next council meeting. I would strongly suggest that.
We can certainly have the information related to our best effort to determine whether the but-for test was met or not. And we can talk in detail about the efforts that we took without any problems.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Now, item next South Lake Carrington, introduction of TIF resolution. Staff will reintroduce resolution R-6418, expressing the city's intent to approve the tax incrementing financing development district created by county for the South Lake project.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor Pro Tem and members of council. I'm still John Henry King, the Economic Development Director. Resolution 64-18. The introduction of a resolution is a process that you would ordinarily have conducted on your consent agenda. But because this relates to the tax increment financing that we've been discussing over several meetings, we are not using the consent process. We're bringing it right out here, so there's no chance for it being overlooked. This resolution of intent is the next step. It's the bridge between the application for tax increment financing and the first step necessary to initiate annexation. And tonight we are presenting the draft of it, and we are asking you to introduce it. I have with me tonight the author of the resolution, should you have questions about that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. King. Thank you very much.
Mr. Mayor Pro Tem.
Yes, ma'am.
Let me just add, this is the document that was created by virtue of the annexation agreement that was intended to start the process. And one of the reasons that it's, when Mr. King says it's not, it would ordinarily be on your consent agenda, I think what he intended to convey was that ordinarily you do resolutions by a single, you introduce and adopt on the same evening, and so you can put it on consent because it doesn't, you don't do a public hearing on it. And you had several resolutions on your consent agenda tonight, but it was the intent of staff to give you the opportunity, because this will start the ball rolling on that annexation agreement, to see what was proposed for your adoption and have the opportunity to address it after you've had the opportunity to digest all of the information that you've heard tonight and that you've requested in addition from staff to be presented to you in 2 weeks.
Okay. Okay. All right, gentlemen.
So you need a motion
Yes,
to
we need a
introduce.
motion. All right. Council, what we have in front of us is a motion to, we just need a motion to introduce resolution for public hearing will take place at October 15th meeting. And Councilmember Trout.
I move that we take into consideration the annexation agreement to be discussed at a future meeting.
Second.
It would be a motion. What staff is proposing is that you have a motion to introduce the resolution.
We have a motion. I need a motion to introduce the resolution.
Oh, I make a motion, okay, not the annexation, okay. I make a motion that we introduce resolution R-64-18.
Second.
Okay. No. All right, so 3-2.
For clarity,
I'm asking all in favor?
You need to vote.
All in favor? Okay, 3-2. All right, motion carries 3-2.
You haven't actually called for the votes in opposition.
Those opposed?
Okay, those opposed? Nay. Okay, thank you. 3-2, motion carries. All right.
Question of staff.
Yes.
Staff, have you received any feedback on this from Mr. Larry Swank?
From who?
Mr. Larry Swank?
No, not directly, sir. I mean, what he said.
Would you like to? Would you like to give feedback to staff? Not tonight, but I mean, yes.
Oh, Mr. Swank, if you could approach us.
This would be for council.
That's everybody's talking about this guy.
We had expected that because this is for information only and not for action tonight.
Correct.
There's no for action, that the next time it is for action, there would be an opportunity for the public to speak.
Correct, but I would like to know, can we get you to get together with staff in the interim? Or do you want to do that?
Oh, yes.
That's what I want to know. I mean, you can still,
That would make
you can
us
still
more-
do it on the 15th, but I mean,
That would make us more informed.
that's what I would think.
Yes, because we don't
Yes.
want to make noise for no purpose.
Maybe you can get you to set a date with the city manager so that you and staff can get together prior to the city meeting, the meeting when we introduce that. I
Thank
think
you,
said
and they
the
have
fifth.
been very open and helpful. Thank you.
Okay. All right.
Okay, that's good to know. Thank you, Mrs. Swank. All right, Councilmember Marcos.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Mayor Pro Tem. I'd like to make a motion to adjourn.
All in favor?
Aye.
Good night, everyone.